What's up, good people? Welcome back to this new episode of our TechTrends podcast. In this podcast, we're going to be talking about a very interesting topic. And of course, this is based on a report that was released by Mozilla Africa a couple of months, or should be a week or a couple of weeks ago. And this report is titled "The African Tech Startups as Engine of Growth and Development." And it covers very interesting aspects or elements about policies, what government needs to do, and of course, to just basically help the growth of this ecosystem. If you read a different report by the Big Deal Africa that was also released a couple of months, or should be a week ago back, earlier this year, it talks about 2023 being a very exciting year for the startups in the region, and of course talks about the year experiencing a rebalancing of investments across the continent's largest markets, that is Egypt, Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa. Actually, when you look at that report by the Big Deal, it talks about how Kenya overtook Nigeria to become the largest market for VCs. So a lot of VCs invested in startups across Kenya. Right, and this report talks now. The other report by Mozilla Africa has other very interesting elements, and the report notes that despite the startup industry in Africa being poised for significant growth, Africa policymakers and ecosystem stakeholders need to take action to address some of the challenges facing these startups. And this is because over the years, policies have continued to actually affect the growth of startups in the region. Governments in the region, have failed to actually prioritize policies that promote entrepreneurship. And this includes things like tax incentives or frameworks, streamlined business registration processes, and even funding. In countries like Kenya, we've seen a lot of startups exiting the market, complaining about the harsh environment. Of course, these are the things that governments have failed to address. And the report has very interesting insights. It says there's an urgent need for vision, clarity of purpose, commitment, and implementation of institutional infrastructure to drive the growth of these startups, right? And it also talks about how political leadership at the highest levels, which of course goes back to even to the presidency, definitely should actually embrace the challenges of driving the growth of the startup ecosystem in the region and lead the way by giving policy directions and actively engaging with lower governance structures to create an enabling environment for startups in each country in Africa. And Mozilla also reports that say government support for innovation and digital entrepreneurship must be much stronger than it currently is. So we're not saying they are good policies. We're basically saying these policies need to be much stronger than they currently are. Okay, so African governments basically can stimulate the culture of entrepreneurship and risk-taking by reducing regulatory barriers, promoting education and mentorship, and celebrating success stories from these African startups. And that can also be considered, and they can also consider enacting startup legislation in addition to basically supportive policies and regulations, and that open up the opportunity for startups to serve Africa through the FTC arrangements. Okay, and however, legislations according to the Mozilla report must enable transnational collaborations and be periodically reviewed. I actually love this bit of the report because in countries like Kenya, we've seen President William Ruto committing to signing the Startup Bill 2022 into law by April this year. So we are looking to that happening by April this year. And this Startup Bill from Kenya has been in the works. The Startup Bill in Kenya has been in the works since 2021 actually, and it seeks to govern the interaction between the government, incubators, startups, and investors. And of course, for registered startups in Kenya will receive incentives such as tax breaks and access to credit. Of course, a move that is expected to boost innovation and job creation in a country with a large population of unemployed youth. So when this bill finally becomes into law, startups will further gain access to much needed resources, including funding, mentorship, and training. And what Mozilla is doing in this report is basically urging governments to do more to deepen the talent pool available to the startup ecosystem. A quote I picked, which I'm going to read from that report: many African founders say that most graduates are fast-baked and need to be retained as the disconnect between academia and industry is said to be huge. Stakeholders are unanimous that Africa's education curriculum need to be strengthened from high school so that the culture of entrepreneurship and innovation can be created and cultivated early on. Nevertheless, this report notes that there's a demonstrable evidence that there is massive potential throughout the African startup ecosystem, even in markets that are currently struggling. And of course, the near sudden influx and relentless growth in the levels of new investments flowing into the African startups year on year, the improving climate of digital transformation and youth entrepreneurship inspired by recent big ticket capital raise and the growing implementation of sectoral incentives through startup acts like what Kenya is doing, offering tax breaks, salary support for new founders, preferential treatment in public tenders, and other government initiatives to altogether hold good promise for the future of the ecosystem in Africa. So, bottom line, African policymakers, the report says, need to adopt an ecosystem approach in coordination with industry to immediately lift national startup regulatory system to address these issues while balancing the interests of various stakeholders. So Mozilla has touched on very important things about policies, which, as I said earlier, has been one of the biggest challenges facing startups in Africa. So what do you think? Do you think African leaders, the political class, the presidency actually doing enough to create an enabling environment for these startups to thrive, right? If we are hoping to see more funding flowing in Africa into these startups, it only makes sense to have fair work environments for them to actually stay, work here, get employment, pay taxes, and it's a win-win situation for both the governments and the startups. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I hope to see you in the next episode of our TechTrends podcast. My name is Nick Kanali. I'll see you in the next one.